You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
When I was a kid, we had this big, giant oak tree right at the edge of our yard before you got to the road on the country lane, and it was super scary and imposing. My brothers and I called it the Great Owl Tree, inspired from The Secret of NIMH, because that was terrifying. If you've seen the film, it's frightening. And if we ever had to go outside at night, it was especially terrifying. I think that between that movie and Poltergeist, 80s kids had every right to be afraid of trees. And it took courage for a 4-year-old to walk outside and witness this tree. But as kids, everything looms large, and often size alone can be intimidating. Grown-ups were scary and sometimes threatening. I have to remind myself that sometimes, especially around younger kids, I should stoop a little bit because I can be unintentionally scary and overwhelming for them. And sometimes we can feel the same way about God. Big and scary, distant, and maybe slightly annoyed at our requests. And so Jesus tells a parable in Luke chapter 18 about a woman who often feels quite small and overlooked, but who will nevertheless show great courage. This is Luke 18, 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and to not lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." And for a while he refused. But later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" So Mrs. Brisby is a widow, and we learn from the outset of the film that she's a single mother struggling to care for her 4 children when their health and well-being are threatened. And like the widow in our passage today, there's more to her than simply her station in life, the fact that she's a widow. There's more bravery and intellect and resolve that most would consider a rodent to have. And Jesus' followers will also find themselves under a similar threat, that their livelihood and well-being is threatened. And in the context of prayer, Jesus is trying to teach them to pray always and to not lose heart, even in the reality of their circumstances. In the back half of Luke's gospel, from about chapter 9 or so forward, it really becomes like a road trip movie where Jesus is steadily making his way to Jerusalem, where he will be killed. And his readers and his followers in that moment are meant to travel that road with him, interacting with people along the way and drawing closer and closer to the moment where they know they also are headed to their own death and distribution from that place as they run for their lives. And even after 2,000 years, we are meant to take this journey as we read through the Gospel of Luke, drawing closer to the powers that be that will wield death as their weapon, feeling smaller and smaller as we draw closer and closer to that point of the cross as our destiny awaits. It's enough for anyone to lose heart and to lose faith and to lose their resolve. And so Jesus will enter into this moment to teach his disciples to pray. And so he tells a story about a widow, maybe named Mrs. Brisby, for all we know, who will not stand for injustice. She relentlessly confronts the embodiment of injustice, pleading her case by getting on his case and annoying the judge. This man had a reputation for disrespect of God and those he was called to serve. But she didn't let that reputation stop her. She knew what was right, and that conviction drove her. Even though she had no power in the relationship between judge and accuser and herself, that sense of righteousness, that sense of resolve, helped her to discover that she held more power than what anyone else in that relationship realized. Because there's power in persistence. There are moments when we don't want to get out of bed, or we do that and that's about enough for the day. But habit is what keeps her going. This nice, smooth rut of rehearsing how every day is going to be until she finds what she needs. This is not a kid's movie, The Secret of NIMH. I mean, it's a kid's movie, it's a cartoon. But there is so much in watching it, even last Friday night, where it's like, should kids be watching this movie? It taught me my first curse word. My mom would wash my mouth out with the brown Listerine. Remember when that was all they had? Because I was merely quoting what Justin said when Mrs. Brisby got caught by the kid in the house. I won't say it here, but it's again, this movie had a lot to do with how I've been formed as a person. But in this movie, we see Mrs. Brisby suffer continually, chased by cats, caught by farmers, blood and bleeding as she scrapes herself, trying to set herself free, sinking in the mud while her children cry out for help and unable to do anything to rescue them. And what we find is that the key to her courage, the reason she signs up for this work to begin with, is simply her persistence. That it is the right and good thing to do to care for her children, to love her family, and nothing will stop her no matter what. That kind of persistence is inspiring. It's worth emulating. When I say, how's it going? And people's response is, it's going. Sometimes that is the very definition of courage. But that moment when she lifts the amulet out of the mud above her while she's surrounded by threat and death in all its forms is one of my most earliest memories of feeling something spiritual, something transcendent, some moment with a capital G, good. And it's just before that moment where Mrs. Brisby is about to lose everything. It would be years later that I came to understand why that moment felt so empowering and inspirational to me, of parents' divorce and feelings of abandonment and loss and wishing for things to be different or better, but not really finding that I had the power as a kid to make that true. The reality of I was scared of a lot more than just a big oak tree. And finding someone who has courage within the midst of that kind of fear is the kind of faith, the kind of hope that I want to have. And so Jesus says, listen to what the unjust judge says. I'm going to grant her justice just to get her off my back. And the point is that even if the most disrespectful and calloused can be moved, how much more can God respond when we cry out for justice? That when we long to see wrongs made right, how much more does God also want to say yes to those prayers? That when we find ourselves getting closer to Golgotha as we march along this road with Jesus, terrified of what cross might be waiting for us, how much more will God's love find us quickly, even though we might be hard to find, small and overlooked, like mice in a field or a widow in an unjust judged court? What we discover is that while there may be those who are cynical or calloused against justice, that God is on our side. And at the very end of this story, there's this little throwaway line that I think has Jesus, as he's telling the story, begins to wonder out loud. We get this thought that maybe slips beyond Jesus' mind and across his lips. Maybe one that the disciples weren't meant to hear, but nevertheless gets recorded. Jesus asked the question, will the Son of Man find faith on earth when he comes? Will there be people like the widow who are faithful, who journey the road to the cross and see what happens when you stand for the poor and the widow and the orphan and the stranger in our midst? When you see what Rome and the powers that Rome has colluded with can do to those who want righteousness? Will there still be faith that will keep us in the midst of seeking righteousness and justice beyond ourselves and for others as well? So much of what the widow was doing didn't really look like prayer. We don't see folded hands or bent knees or bowed head, no Our Fathers or Amens. Probably what she was doing was a lot of waiting in line, rehearsing her opening, practicing her retort, packing a lunch if the day was going to be long. And yet this is the kind of prayer that Jesus is lifting up for his followers. An embodied faith, a doing sort of faith that moves us beyond our own sorrow and into fighting for what is right. This story is told so that we would always pray and not lose heart. That's what Jesus explains from the outset. And prayer and persistence go together. But they don't have to look the same for everyone. Prayer of this kind is a prayer that sustains us to keep hope in the face of injustice. And so what is it that sustains you to keep hope in the face of injustice? What is it that draws us to keep putting our shoes on in the morning and speaking out against the wrongs that plague our neighbors and our communities and our world? For some, that might be formal prayer. But sometimes that prayer looks more like protest or volunteering or creative expression. But no matter what it is a faith that sustains us at our most vulnerable, which means we have to acknowledge our vulnerability. Some of that vulnerability may come because you're a widow, or because you're new to faith, or strapped for cash, or struggle with depression, or whatever it may be. But by naming the fact that we are widows, orphans, strangers, field mice, what we find is the courage that what we are called to do does not ignore our circumstances. It doesn't pretend that we are impervious because we sing songs about Jesus. The courage we need is a courage that will stand even though we often feel too weak to do so, that cries even though we feel unheard, that believes even though we doubt. A courage that would seek community even when we feel better off alone. And the reality is Jesus will call us all to be courageous. The question is will Jesus find faith when he finds us? Will we as a people of faith find the widow to lift them up, find the lonely and befriend them, find the poor and provide? Will we be a people of courage that is foolish enough to hope, that is foolish enough to try today, because it might be the day? My hope is that each of us finds a heart that can be brave in spite of the circumstances around us, that we would seek the blessings of God to come to all as we seek to be courageous and persistent in our prayers. Amen.